We're going to move on to our next item of business, which is a statement from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, on COVID-19. The First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on the First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I will give a summary of today's statistics. The total number of positive cases reported yesterday was 1,248. That is 9.7% of all tests carried out, and the total number of cases is now 83,259. 1,249 people are currently in hospital, an increase of 22 from yesterday. 95 people are in intensive care, that's 3 fewer than yesterday. And I regret to say that in the past 24 hours, a further 37 deaths have been registered of patients who first tested positive over the previous 28 days. The total number of deaths under that measurement is now 3,323. Once again, my deepest condolences go to all those who have lost a loved one. National Records of Scotland will publish its weekly report tomorrow. This records deaths confirmed through a test as being COVID-related and also those that are presumed to be so. Presiding Officer, it is very likely, based on the numbers we have reported in the past 7 days, that the death toll on that wider measure will this week pass 5,000. That is a sombre and deeply distressing milestone. It is important that we acknowledge it and also that we remember every individual whose life has been lost to this virus. These figures remind us of the harm and the heartbreak that COVID causes if it is allowed to spread. The figures also provide important context to today's statement, in which I will report on the outcome of the Scottish Government's review of the COVID protection levels and set out the difficult but necessary decisions we have reached about the appropriate level of protection in each local authority area. In reaching these decisions, the Scottish Government has taken careful account of case numbers and test positivity in different parts of Scotland. We have also considered the trends in each area and the pace or otherwise of these trends, and we have assessed what all of this might mean for hospital and intensive care capacity. We're publishing today the up-to-date and detailed data for each local authority area on the Scottish Government website. We take advice from the National Incident Management Team, the Chief Medical Officer and National Clinical Director on the measures needed to control the virus, and also from a range of senior officials on minimising the wider harms that result from COVID restrictions. We also consult with local authorities before reaching a final judgment, which the Cabinet did this morning. Parliament will have the opportunity to debate these decisions, I understand, on Thursday. This week, given that the level system has now been in place for almost 3 weeks, we've also had the chance to reflect on what we have learned so far about the effectiveness of different levels in reducing prevalence of the virus and on the importance of acting quickly and firmly against COVID. Let me turn to an assessment of the situation we face before setting out the decisions we have reached. The first thing I want to be very clear about is that the restrictions that have been in place in recent weeks on household gatherings and hospitality have made a difference. They have slowed down the increase in cases considerably, and they have helped to flatten the infection curve. In early October, we were on a trajectory that, without action, would have seen us reporting by now around 3,000 cases each day. Clearly, that has not happened. Daily case numbers are almost a third of that. Prevalence in Scotland is, at this point, also lower than in other UK nations. So we have made progress, and that's thanks to people across the country. But the overall level of infection remains higher than we need it to be, and the national picture is masking significant regional variations. While some areas have low and even slightly declining infection rates, a number of local authorities across central Scotland have case numbers and test positivity that are significantly above the national average. And while the situation in many of them has stabilised, it has done so at a stubbornly high level. This creates concern for a number of reasons that I will set out in a moment. In summary, therefore, the Cabinet has decided as follows. 19 council areas, the majority, will see no change to their levels this week. I am pleased to say that from the start of next week, assuming of course no significant deterioration in the situation before then, 2 areas will move down from level 3 to level 2. However, 11 local authorities will, from 6 p.m. on Friday, for a strictly limited period, move from level 3 to level 4. I will set out the details of all of these decisions in a moment. However, I am acutely aware that for many individuals and businesses, these decisions will be both disappointing and distressing. They demand more sacrifice from all of us. So I want to take a moment to remind people why these decisions are necessary and what they are intended to achieve. Firstly, they are necessary to ensure that the National Health Service can cope with the range of pressures it will face over the winter. We must ensure that hospital and intensive care services are there, not just for those with COVID, but for everyone who needs them. That means we must get case numbers down from current levels before going into a period when winter pressures are very likely to increase. Second, these decisions will give us the best possible chance, albeit in a limited and careful way, of being able to ease restrictions in all parts of Scotland for Christmas. That is something all of us want to look forward to, but we also know it will increase the risks of transmission, so we must get infection rates to a lower baseline now. And third, these decisions will help us limit the impact of the virus, including in loss of life, as we steer a path through the next few months towards the brighter times that are now within sight as vaccines and better treatments become available. Difficult though today's decisions undoubtedly are, please do not forget that an end to all of this is now within our grasp. But we must get through the next few months as safely as possible, and that means tough decisions cannot be avoided, no matter how much you and I fervently wish that they could be. Let me turn now to the detail of our decisions, starting with the local authorities that are remaining within their current level. I can confirm that Orkney, Shetland, the Western Isles, Moray and the Highlands will remain in level 1. For now, in common with the rest of the country, we are asking people in Moray and the Highlands not to visit other people's houses. However, for all areas in level 1, it will be permissible from Thursday this week to meet outdoors with up to 8 people from a maximum of 3 households. I can confirm that Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire, the Borders, Dumfries and Galloway and Argyll and Bute will all remain at level 2. We hope that these areas, perhaps Argyll and Bute in particular, will be able to move to level 1 soon. However, in some of these areas, we have seen an increase in cases in recent days. We are particularly concerned about quite sharp increases, albeit, I should say, from a relatively low level in both Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. That leads me to a general point, and indeed to a plea to everyone living in level 1 and 2 areas. Please do not assume that being in one of the lower levels means that you can ease up. On the contrary, having fewer restrictions mean that the virus has more opportunities to spread. So it is more vital to abide by all the rules and precautions. Please use the postcode checker on our website to remind yourselves of what the restrictions are in your area, and please stick to them. I'm pleased to report that East Lothian and Mid Lothian have both seen a marked decline in infection rates. Prevalence in these areas is significantly below the level for Scotland as a whole. On that basis, assuming no significant deterioration before then, I can confirm that East Lothian and Mid Lothian will move down from level 3 to level 4 from next Tuesday, the 24th of November. From level 3 to level 2 from next Tuesday, the 24th of November. Between now and then, the local authorities will be able to undertake necessary environmental health and compliance checks and work with NHS Lothian to minimise any risk of increased transmission that the move to level 2 will bring. I can confirm that the City of Edinburgh, Clackmannanshire, Falkirk, Inverclyde, North Ayrshire, Dundee, Fife, Perth and Kinross and Angus will all remain at level 3 for now. These areas, to varying degrees, are all making some progress, though it does remain fragile. However, if that progress continues, we are hopeful that these areas will move to level 2 soon. Let me now turn, Presiding Officer, to our decisions about level 4. The council areas that will move to level 4 for a limited period from Friday are the City of Glasgow, Renfrewshire, East Renfrewshire, East Dunbartonshire, West Dunbartonshire, North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, East Ayrshire, South Ayrshire, Stirling and West Lothian. In all of these areas, there are grounds for continued and significant concern. In the 7 days up to Friday, Scotland as a whole had just over 140 new cases of COVID per 100,000 people. All of the areas moving to level 4 were above that level, ranging from West Lothian with a rate of 158 cases per 100,000 to Glasgow with 277. Test positivity for all of these areas, with the exception of Western Bartonshire, was also above the average. Stirling has experienced a particularly sharp increases in cases over the past week. While some of that can be attributed to specific outbreaks, there is also a level of community transmission there that must be tackled. In the other areas, infection rates have stabilised or even slightly fallen as a result of level 3 measures. However, and this is the key point of concern, the infection rate in all of these areas remains stubbornly and worryingly high. At these levels, we simply do not have the assurance we need that hospital and ICU services will be able to cope as we go deeper into the winter. Pressure on hospitals in these areas and on those who work in them is already severe, and with the additional pressure that the coming weeks may bring, it could easily become intolerable. And further, at these levels, we would not have the flexibility we need to ease restrictions over Christmas, which, in common with the other UK nations, we so desperately want to do. The clear advice of our public health experts, therefore, is that we must drive infection rates down further in these areas, and they are not confident that level 3 restrictions will do this to the extent necessary. That is why, albeit very reluctantly, we have taken the decision to place these areas into level 3 for a limited period. The level 4 restrictions will be in place for 3 weeks and will be lifted on the 11th of December. And I want to be clear on that point because I know people are frustrated that other restrictions have remained in place longer than planned. But level 4 is intended to be short and sharp. And in this situation, it is specifically intended to have an impact in advance of Christmas and the most challenging winter period. Lifting the level 4 restrictions then, as we will do, also means that they will not be in place for most of the Hanukkah period. So again, while celebrations may be different, there will be a greater degree of freedom. We will assess nearer the time the level that will apply in each area when the level 4 restrictions end on 11th December. And even if it does not happen immediately for all of them, we hope and expect that the action we are taking now will allow these areas to move down to level 2 much more quickly than would otherwise be the case. Let me turn now to what level 4 means for people living in these areas. Firstly, as is the case already, you must not visit other people's homes, though you can still meet outdoors with up to 6 people from 2 households. However, our advice is that you should stay at or close to home as much as possible. The purpose of level 4 is to reduce interactions between people from different households as much as possible, to reduce transmission as quickly as possible. That means limiting work and social contacts. Those who can work from home should do so, though unlike lockdown earlier in the year, construction and manufacturing workplaces will remain open. Only essential indoor retail premises will remain open for this 3-week period. Non-essential retail will close. Close contact services like hairdressers and beauty salons, visitor attractions, leisure and entertainment settings and indoor gyms will also close for this period. And with the exception of takeaway services, hospitality premises will close too. So except for some very limited purposes, including childcare or caring for someone who is vulnerable, exercise or shopping for essential goods, people living in level 4 areas should not be going out and about over this 3-week period. I know this will be tough. This pandemic is having an impact on mental health for most, if not all of us. If you need someone to talk to, you can find out what support is available at clearyourhead.scot or by calling NHS 111. But also please remember this. Our objective in taking this action now is to protect the NHS, create the prospect of seeing some loved ones at Christmas and completing the journey to next spring with as few restrictions as possible and with the minimum impact on life and health. Presiding Officer, let me turn now to the issue of travel. Notwithstanding the difficult decisions today for significant parts of the country, the level system is still allowing us to avoid a national one-size-fits-all lockdown, such as is currently in place, for example, in England. In my view, that is important. It means that people and businesses in lower prevalence areas like the Highlands or parts of Lothian are not forced into level 4 restrictions by the situation in higher prevalence areas like Glasgow. But the ability to maintain that targeted approach depends on us not spreading the virus from high to low prevalence areas. And that becomes even more important with parts of the country in level 4. To put it bluntly, and we will require to monitor this, if we were to see evidence that people from East or South Ayrshire are visiting places in North Ayrshire, for example, or that people from Glasgow are going to Inverclyde, we would have no choice but to consider level 4 for these areas too, and we don't want to do that. So it is essential that we all abide by travel restrictions. To underline how important this is, I can confirm that the guidance that has been in place in recent weeks will become law from Friday. That means people living in level 3 or level 4 must not travel outside their own council area except for certain essential purposes. People living elsewhere in Scotland mustn't travel to level 3 or level 4 areas except for essential purposes. And there must be no essential travel between Scotland and other parts of the UK. Presiding Officer, I know this is difficult, but it is essential. Broadly comparable restrictions have been or continue to be in force in England and in Wales. And if we are to maintain a targeted approach and allow low prevalence areas to live with fewer restrictions, I can't stress enough how important it is that we all abide by these rules. Presiding Officer, let me say a few words now about schools, those in the shielding category, business support, and finally, the wider action we are taking to beat the virus. I'm aware that there are some people who argue that schools should also be closed at level 4. However, our very clear view is that the harm done to young people by closing schools significantly outweighs any impact that schools have on transmission. Keeping schools open is therefore a priority. However, we will keep the guidance for schools and how it is being implemented under close review. A further evidence paper on school safety will be published by the Deputy First Minister tomorrow. There are also specific measures in place for those on the shielding list. We currently recommend that children who are shielding should not attend school in person in level 4 areas. More broadly, I know this is an anxious time for people who were shielding. We're not advising the same strict isolation as in the previous lockdown. We know how harmful that is to well-being. Instead, the advice is to be especially vigilant. The Chief Medical Officer will be writing directly to all people in level 4 areas who were on the shielding list to provide more detailed advice. These restrictions are also very difficult for business, and so we are making more financial support available. In addition to the UK furlough scheme, all businesses that require to close at any level are eligible for a 4-weekly grant of £2,000 or £3,000, depending on rateable value. Grants of £1,400 or £2,100 are available to businesses that are open but subject to trading restrictions. Eligible businesses can apply for these grants now through their local authorities. I can also confirm today that in addition to this, we are establishing a £30 million discretionary fund to enable local authorities to provide additional support for businesses where they consider that necessary or justified. For example, for businesses in supply chains or to taxi drivers suffering a severe but indirect effect. We will also make an additional £15 million available for newly self-employed people who have not been able to access other forms of support. And we are making an additional £15 million available to local authorities to help with the community and social impact of a move to level 4, and more details of these funds will be made available shortly. Presiding Officer, I have focused necessarily in this statement on restrictions. But our focus now increasingly and much more positively is also on the other ways of beating this virus. We do have real reasons to be optimistic that science will get us out of this pandemic, and soon. So later this week, the Health Secretary will set out to Parliament our plans to start vaccinating the most vulnerable as soon as stocks of an approved vaccine are available, hopefully even before the end of this calendar year, and then to roll this out across the adult population as quickly as supplies allow. And next week, now that we have a supply of lateral flow tests, the Health Secretary will set out our plans for mass testing. This will include more detail of the plans announced already to test care home visitors, NHS staff and students, but it will also set out plans for geographic mass testing, drawing on the lessons of the pilot underway in Liverpool and the options for extending mass testing to other groups of key workers. And that perhaps is an appropriate point to end on. This pandemic is taking its toll on all of us, and of course on some so much more than on others. I know that today's decisions will add to that for many, and I am truly sorry for that. Whether you agree with the decisions or not, please know they are not taken lightly. But they are essential to get us to the other side of this as safely as possible. That means all of us sticking to the rules and remembering facts in everything we do. And it means holding firm to what this is all for. in the midst of a global pandemic that is nobody's fault, this action is necessary. It is necessary to protect ourselves and those we love from a potentially deadly virus. It's essential to help the NHS look after all of us who need it, to give us the hope of some respite and time with our loved ones at Christmas, and with as little suffering and loss of life as possible, to help us complete the final stage of this horrible journey to the point, hopefully next spring, when we will be vaccinating, testing and treating our way back to normality. I can never thank everyone enough for all the sacrifices that are being made, and I will never underestimate how difficult it is. But I do hold to the belief that love and solidarity, albeit with a lot of help from science, will get us through this, and that soon we will be looking back on it, not living through it. So please try to stay strong, and please stick with it and stick together.
Thank you very much, First Minister. First Minister will now take questions, starting with Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all appreciate that there are no guarantees in a situation like this. But if the evidence points to an essential calculation that accepting 3 weeks of level 4 restrictions for those authorities affected in order to win a more general easing of restrictions over the Christmas and New Year period, then that is, with regret, a judgment that we will take at face value. And the need to get through the next few months with the virus as widely suppressed as possible is all the more important, with the enormously encouraging news over recent days that vaccines with efficacy rates of 90% or more are now a real prospect by year's end. But whatever the promise of an eventual vaccination programme, today's news will come as an immediate hammer blow for thousands of small businesses in the affected areas who have fought since March to stay open, to keep their head above water, surviving the spring lockdown and late summer and autumn restrictions, only to be faced again now with a further period of closure. Sustained government support will be critical to their survival, and we have seen the concerns expressed by business organisations over the past 24 hours, concerns that we expect ministers to address head on. But today I want to specifically ask about the situation in our hospitals. In the latest projections in the documents accompanying the statement, it shows that NHS Lanarkshire, Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Ayrshire and Arran could run out of COVID hospital beds over the next few weeks, and that ICU capacity in those areas, along with Fife and Forth Valley, will also soon be reached. While we must hope for the best that this will not be the case, we must also plan for the worst. So can I ask the First Minister, does each hospital in these health board areas have a contingency plan to manage the situation should it arise? Can she provide an update on the progress of mutual aid arrangements between NHS boards to ensure that there is enough capacity to deal with peak levels of demands as set out in the Winter Preparedness Plan? And according to that plan, at least 4 months' supply of all key PPE commodities was to have been procured from the end of October, as was a national stockpile of 60 ICU and supportive care medicines by the end of November. So can she confirm that all of these items have indeed now been secured? Our NHS staff have worked heroically over the last 8 months. We must spare no effort in making sure that they have the resources and protection that they need for this very worrying period ahead.
First Minister.
Can I thank Ruth Davison for these questions? I'll try to, as briefly as possible, address all of them. Firstly, just to reiterate the point that I made in my statement, these decisions are unpalatable, but they are necessary. They are necessary to protect the NHS, to open up that space, I hope, at Christmas, and also to get us through what I hope, increasingly hope, is the final stage of this journey with as little loss of life as possible. That's why we have reached these decisions. And I know there will be people who disagree with these decisions. I can hear there are people in this chamber who strongly disagree with these decisions. I respect that, but I hope that nobody will think that these decisions are being taken lightly or without very serious consideration and assessment of their necessity. The impact on business, firstly, the impact first and foremost of this pandemic is on individuals, but I absolutely understand the impact on businesses of all sizes, but small businesses in particular. I would make 2 points there, and these are points members will want to follow up in the days to come. Firstly, it is concern for businesses that makes me so determined for as far as we can to stick with the levels approach, so that small businesses in Highland are not being closed down because of high prevalence in Glasgow or Lanarkshire, and I think that is important. I say this genuinely not as a criticism of decisions that other governments are taking. Every government is trying to take the best decisions that it can, but we have so far, and I hope will continue, to avoid a national lockdown. And that is the targeted approach that I think is good for businesses as well as for individuals. But also we are today making available additional financial support to help with businesses. As I understand it, in England, above the level of grant support, local authorities are given a discretionary 5%, or I think on a level above that. What we've announced today in terms of the discretionary funding for local authorities is significantly more than that. It will never be enough to compensate every business for every loss. I recognise that, but we will continue to ensure maximum support for businesses is available. On hospital and ICU capacity, one of the reasons we are taking the really difficult decisions we are taking today around Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Lanarkshire and Stirling as far as it relates to Forth Valley is to make sure that our hospitals and our ICU facilities do not get to the point over the winter period where they cannot cope. And I believe this action will help to protect our health service, but all health boards have contingency plans in place for ICU. That involves plans to double ICU capacity and then, if necessary, to treble ICU capacity. Mutual aid is already underway. So, for example, one of the reasons Forth Valley is under pressure right now is the assistance that will be given in terms of some patients to Lanarkshire Health Board. So these mutual aid arrangements will continue to work where necessary. And finally, yes, I can confirm we'll make some of this information available through SPICE, that we have all of the supplies of PPE that we have assessed are required. We have healthy stocks of PPE. Unlike at the start of the pandemic, and I think this is true for governments across the UK, we now get a significant proportion of our PPE. I think at the start of the pandemic it was all imported. Now a significant proportion is from Scottish companies. So we've been able to build some economic resilience as well as health resilience there. And we also, of course, have a much greater supply of intensive care ventilators than we did at the start of the pandemic, should they be needed as well.
Thank you. Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the First Minister for advance sight of her statement. Swimming pools and gyms closed, driving lessons stopped, visitor attractions closed, tourism shut down, hairdressers closed, non-essential retail shops closed, hospitality shut down completely. That is the stark difference between Tier 3 and Tier 4. In replying to me in Parliament last week, the First Minister said, the Cabinet's decision on which tier people live in was a judgment, and judgment must combine with the hard data. So can the First Minister explain to people like those in North and South Lanarkshire what the hard data is, what the evidence is, to move them up a tier at a time when the transmission rate in Lanarkshire is coming down? And what assurance can she give them and millions of others moving to level 4 this Friday that this time 3 weeks really does mean just 3 weeks?
Minister.
On that last point, I've made very clear. I understand that people have been frustrated that restrictions that were meant to be limited previously have not been. But level 4, for the reasons Richard Leonard has set out, is meant to be a short, sharp intervention. We've looked carefully at the Welsh experience, which it's still too early to say what the impact of that has been, but a fire break that they lifted after 2 weeks. And it may be after 3 weeks we don't have all of the evidence flowing through into the data, but the level 4 restrictions will end on the 11th of December, and then we will decide what levels these areas go into then. I absolutely readily acknowledge the difference in terms of the economy and people's lives between living in level 3 and living in level 4. But I hope Richard Leonard will also take this point seriously, that the difference between level 3 and level 4 for Lanarkshire, for Glasgow, for these other areas, it may be also fewer people dying over the next period, and it may be the difference between our NHS being able to cope and not cope. He asked me for the evidence. The data for each local authority is being published today, as he is aware. If you look at cases per 100,000 over the past 7 days, the national average is 141. In North Lanarkshire, it's 238. And in South Lanarkshire, 229. Test positivity, national average is 7%. In North Lanarkshire, it's 10.3 and 9.5 in South Lanarkshire. Rates have declined very slightly, but the 238 in North Lanarkshire at the end of last week is only down from 274 at the start of November. So it has stabilised and slightly decreased, but it must come down faster to deal with the biggest and most important bit of evidence that Ruth Davidson actually referred to in her question, that if we don't act now, there is a risk that hospital and ICU services in NHS Lanarkshire, as winter pressures kick in, would not be able to cope with COVID and other winter pressures. So that's why we're taking this action now, and I believe it is, I know it's a difficult thing to do, but I believe it is the right thing to do in the interest of protecting the National Health Service and saving lives. And fundamentally, that is the most important responsibility I have right now.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. The continued rise in cases as we go into winter is a cause of deep concern, and though we recognise the impact that lockdowns have, the Scottish Greens support the move of those local authorities most affected into Tier 4. And given the transmission of the virus across the country, we recognise the need to put travel restrictions into law. But would we be in such a grave situation had the Scottish Government followed the World Health Organisation mantra of test, test, test? We provided the First Minister with evidence in support of regular testing 6 months ago, and Parliament has now voted for this to happen. I note the First Minister said that a statement next week will cover options for extending testing to other groups of key workers. I sincerely hope that setting out options does not suggest any further delay. So can the First Minister confirm that this statement will finally see the Scottish Government introduce regular testing for all key workers in health and care, in education and in our communities as a matter of the greatest urgency?
First Minister.
I want to address some of these points very directly because they're important points. But in the question of would we be in this situation if, whether it's testing or anything else, we'll have to look across the UK, Europe and the world right now to see that Scotland is far from unique. Actually, Scotland has lower prevalence than all other UK nations and many countries across Europe right now. That doesn't mean we've done everything right, far from it, but we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and that cannot simply be cast aside. In terms of testing, we have on PCR testing, the main diagnostic test that we've had available, we have prioritised testing those who have symptoms, because that is how we need to, through test and protect, best break those chains of transmission. We have not had, until relatively recently, the technology to do routine, regular testing on a mass scale. We do now have lateral flow testing. We hope to have more of these, but we have a supply of these already. And that then, from now, opens up the potential to do much more. There are still some hurdles and also some limitations. So, for example, on lateral flow testing, unless this is changed over the course of today, we're expecting potentially this to change in the next day or so. These are not licensed for unsupervised use. We hope that will change, which will then allow tests to be provided to employers, whether in the public or private sector, to use routinely with their workers. So as the technology advances, so too does the approach that we take. Obviously, there are logistical issues. We are looking carefully at the pilot in Liverpool in terms of rolling out mass testing on a geographic basis. I think there are some very important lessons there in terms of trying to support maximum take-up of testing like that. So we are moving forward with developing technology as soon as we are able to do so, and the Health Secretary will set out more details of that next week.
Thank you. And Willie Rennie.
5,000 deaths, that's truly a terrible toll. It's a dark day. And that heavy toll is the reason why I've supported a cautious approach. People too want to help, but they deserve an explanation. So why are the thresholds in the strategy framework, published only 3 weeks ago, being replaced already? Why are restrictions being ratcheted up in parts of the country, including a serious travel ban, where the number of cases is going down? And in that context, why is the government shutting down sectors of society and business without clear evidence that they are the cause of the spread? The impact on mental health, as well as business and the economy, will be considerable from this. So is the First Minister sure these sacrifices will help cut the virus? Is the First Minister sure this is going to work?
First Minister.
I am as sure as I can be in an inherently uncertain and unpredictable situation that what we are announcing today will drive infection rates lower to the levels that we need them to be in these central belt areas. The restrictions that have been in place so far have stopped what would otherwise have been a rapid increase in cases. They have stabilised them. In some areas, they have slightly reduced them. But for all the reasons I've set out, we cannot go into winter, not if we are sensible, with a stubbornly high level of cases across the most populated part of our country. And the thresholds in the levels framework have not been changed. We look at the thresholds or indicators, whatever you want to describe them, and then we apply judgment around that. So if you look at Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Lanarkshire, both their case numbers and their test positivity are at the level where you would be starting to consider level 4, but what tips them over into that, apart from the stubbornly high nature of the cases, is the pressure and the potential pressure on hospital services. The same is true about hospital services with Ayrshire and with Stirling in relation to Forth Valley. So we pay attention to those indicators, but we have to apply the judgment on the advice of clinical and public health experts about what is necessary to get infection levels down. And, you know, we always have to make balanced decisions here. I am under no illusions about how difficult all of this is for everybody. Countries the world over are going through this right now. We are thankfully managing to avoid applying a lockdown across our whole country, and I hope that will continue. But I do not want to see us over what I hope is the final stage of this, assuming the optimistic scientific news materialises, as we all fervently hope it does in the spring of next year. I want us in that period to minimise the loss of life. I want to minimise the number of people, including young people, who this time next year will be suffering from long COVID and the health complications of COVID. And I want to minimise economic damage too, because there is a fallacy that if we just don't take restrictions to control the virus, the economic pain won't happen. In actual fact, what will happen is that the virus will run more out of control and the economic pain will be deeper and longer. So none of this is palatable for anybody. I hate standing here announcing decisions like this. I probably can never find the words to properly encapsulate just how much I hate it. But my job is to do what I think is necessary. It's not to do what is popular. It's to do, taking account of all of the advice and judgment I can, is to do what I think is necessary to get us through this next phase of the virus as safely as I possibly can.
Thank you. We're going to move on to questions from backbenchers. Succinct questions and succinct answers. We'll get through, hopefully, all of our members. Shona Robertson, who joins us remotely, to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you. Last week, Dundee saw a 29% decrease in case numbers per 100,000, and this week it's disappointing that we've seen an increase of 11%. Can the First Minister say whether the data has identified any specific areas that are the cause of this increase in order to ensure that every effort is taken within these areas to reverse that increase?
First Minister.
Dundee has had a slight increase over the past 7 days, but generally speaking, Dundee has made good progress since it went into level 3, and we hope that that will continue. And this is, I know people understandably, because I find myself doing it as well, you want to know exactly what is the cause of an increase, what is driving, and we look carefully at what comes through Test and Protect and the other information we've got. But fundamentally, the virus spreads because people are interacting and allowing it to spread. And that means that overall, when we have community transmission, we have to, and this is the really tough bit of all of this, we have to reduce those interactions, whether those are in social settings or in workplaces. I know how difficult the household restrictions are, and I know they are probably, it is probably the restriction that people are most likely to maybe try to get around or maybe think that they can safely breach it on one occasion. And I understand that, and I am not criticising anybody for doing that. I know how much all of us, me included, are missing our families right now. But that is one of the areas where we give the virus the most risk of spreading, and I appeal to people. partly so that we can perhaps ease this a bit for Christmas, please do not mix in each other's houses, because that is giving the virus opportunities to spread. And I would say that to people in Dundee and people across the country, with the exception of Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles.
Donald Cameron, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you. Can the First Minister outline how the laws implementing a ban on travel in and out of level 3 and 4 areas will be policed and enforced? And does she acknowledge the very serious difficulties it creates for those who live on or near council boundaries?
First Minister.
They are obviously not, none of the restrictions that we put in place are easy to enforce. The regulations will be... Presiding Officer,
some order, please.
If Mike Rumbles wants to ask a question, I'm more than happy to answer it, but he is shouting repeatedly at me from a sedentary position. I know he vehemently disagrees with what I'm setting out, but I really hope he will have enough respect to understand that these are not easy decisions and they are not decisions that are being taken lightly. Coming back to the important and perfectly legitimate question, the police will enforce these regulations in the way that the police have enforced all of the regulations that have been in place. In other words, it will be a last resort. Police will use the same approach that they have used for household restrictions from the stay-at-home regulations earlier in the pandemic, where they will, if they have reason to believe that people are breaching the rules, they will remind them, advise them what the rules are, encourage them to comply, and only when there is clear and flagrant breach will enforcement be an option that they use. It's not for me to tell the Chief Constable operationally how to do that. I know this is not easy for the police, but making sure that people understand the reasons for these restrictions and the reasons why it's so important that people do not travel from high to low prevalence areas, in my judgment, just as has happened previously in Wales, is happening, albeit in a different form in England, where the law is not to leave your home without reasonable excuse. I believe that passing these regulations sends a very clear and strong message to people about the importance of us complying with these rules.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I'm sure everyone is relieved that an effective vaccine for COVID-19 could be with us in weeks. A number of constituents have already been in touch, anxious to know where in the vaccination prioritisation list they might be. Obviously, the most vulnerable must be vaccinated first. However, will there be an all-Scotland clinically agreed vaccination protocol that the public will be informed of? And will vaccine distribution be based on the number of vulnerable people in a health board area, rather than simply its population, to ensure that areas such as Ayrshire and Nairn do not lose out, and there is an even spread of vaccination according to risk?
First Minister.
So the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisations will provide expert clinical advice that will inform decisions on how any vaccine is used. The Health Secretary, as I said earlier on, is going to set out more detail of our plan in Parliament later this week, I think on Thursday. There's interim advice already being provided by the JCVI, which proposes older as adult residents in care homes and care home workers, health and social care workers, and those over 80 as initial priority groups, although this advice could change as further clinical or scientific evidence emerges, and we will adjust our plans if necessary. Arrangements for delivery of the vaccine, which will include health board allocation, will depend on a number of factors. That will include regulatory and advisory bodies approving the vaccines for use, the supply that we have, and the particular characteristics of the vaccine. So we are considering a number of different delivery routes to make sure that any vaccines that become available can be used effectively. And we will be making specific provision to ensure adequate vaccine supply to rural and island communities. Initial plans, as I say, will be set out by Jean Freeman on Thursday, and we will keep Parliament updated as we get towards what I still hope will be this year, getting the first vaccinations to people.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
The Glasgow's infection rates had been showing a downward trend, so it's very disappointing that Glasgow's moving to Tier 4. But can the First Minister give Glaswegians some hope that at the end of this pain that we won't end up simply in Tier 3 on the 11th of December? But does the First Minister recognise that the non-essential businesses who thought, well, for many in December is a really, really important period, and a period which they could maybe have recouped some of their losses, that the business support should take that into consideration? Is the First Minister confident that the 30 million for 11 local authorities is enough to recognise the needs of these businesses?
First Minister.
Well, £30 million is over and above the other business support that's available. Of course, we'll keep it under review. As I understand the arrangements elsewhere in the UK is more than has been provided elsewhere, although that will not necessarily help all businesses with absolutely every loss, but we will continue to do the maximum we can. Parliament Neil's right that we have seen a very gradual, in the past 7 days, decline in cases, but it is very gradual. And if you look at and people can go onto the website and see this, if we look at the lines on the graph in Glasgow, they are very flat. Now, without the restrictions that people have been living with, they wouldn't be flat, they would have shot through the roof. So flat is not bad, but it is not good enough. We must get infection rates down if we are to ensure that the health service can cope and that we do have that ability to ease up over Christmas. One of the reasons for places like Glasgow, one of the other reasons to go to level 4 is to accelerate a move to level 2. Now, whether it remains for an assessment near the time to know whether that will happen straight from level 4 to level 2 or back via level 3. But if I look at Glasgow right now, without further action, level 3 looks as if it would have to be in place for an extended period of time yet. So a period in level 4 may actually be, for places like Glasgow, a quicker route out of level 3 than simply remaining in level 3. And that's difficult for people, I understand. But in the medium to long term, I believe it will be better for Glaswegians, of which, of course, I am one.
Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I firstly extend my deepest condolences to the family and friends of residents at the Fairview Care Home in Bannockburn who died as a result of COVID-19, and of course everyone who's lost a loved one. First Minister, small and boutique shops under Tier 4 in my constituency of Stirling will have to close, but are very concerned that mixed retail will remain open and continue selling non-essential goods, giving them an unfair advantage during the crucial sales period prior to Christmas. Shopkeepers are looking for a level playing field with mixed retail and supermarkets. So what assurances can the First Minister give in this regard? And can the First Minister also advise on whether non-essential shops can offer collection services to support them and continue to sell goods online or by telephone?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, my condolences also go to friends and family members of residents who have lost loved ones at the Fairview Care Home. The Health and Social Care Partnership and Public Health team are providing regular support to the service to manage the outbreak there. In terms of retailers, it is possible in level 4 that retailers that are required to close can continue trading online or through click and collect and telephone ordering services. Additionally, there is the grant funding available to businesses that have to temporarily close. I've set that out already, and the additional discretionary funding that I've also spoken about. Information on eligibility and how to apply for that is available on the Find Business Support website. I understand that there will always be perceived unfairnesses. We will try to make any of these arrangements as fair as possible and consider that on an ongoing basis. But of course, people require to continue to have access to essential retail, which is what we are seeking to achieve.
Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The closure of non-food retail shops in the 11 local authority areas for 3 weeks will be devastating for these businesses in what is normally the busiest shopping period of the year in the run-up to Christmas. Now, the Scottish Government has received, over the past few weeks, additional guaranteed funding of £1.7 billion from the UK Government. Can the First Minister ensure that adequate support is being given to affected businesses, not just those having to close, but also those in the supply chain who are legally permitted to trade, but will be suffering substantial losses due to the closure of other premises?
First Minister.
I know how devastating this is to businesses, large, small, in every sector. It weighs heavily on me, as I know it does on all of us. But I also know how devastating this virus is to families who lose loved ones to it. So that's what we are trying to navigate a way through. Yes, I can give an assurance that we will ensure every possible penny of business support is made available. In terms of support for businesses that are not legally required to close but have trading restricted, we provide grant support, and I set out the details of that. We actually provided that before the UK Government decided to do similar and make consequential funding available. That's important. So too is the discretionary funding I've announced today, which will enable councils to deliver more support for businesses in the supply chain, for people who are indirectly affected but severely affected. I know taxi drivers have made a very strong case recently, but also give local authorities some discretion to provide additional funding if they think there is a case to be made for that. So we will continue to ensure that as much funding as possible is made available. As I said earlier on, I obviously don't know all of the details of how these systems work in England, but my understanding is that over and above the funding for the grant level, local authorities have an additional 5% discretion. What we've announced today will be more than that. I am not standing here saying that any business will think it is enough, but we will continue to make sure that we treat businesses as fairly as possible. We're asking them to do unprecedented things, and it's important that we respond with unprecedented support.
Willie Coffey to be followed by Alec Rowley.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I wanted to ask the First Minister about support for long COVID sufferers, but in light of the announcement as it relates to East, North and South Ayrshire, could the First Minister please say a little more about the reasons East and South Ayrshire are to move to level 4, while North Ayrshire remains at level 3 and being inundated with inquiries at the moment as the session continues?
First Minister.
I don't think I'm breaching any confidences by saying this was one of the most difficult decisions that the Cabinet reached this morning. And the reasons are that we are seeing in North Ayrshire right now a lower level of prevalence and test positivity, 140 cases per 100,000 on the last 7 days, which is slightly below the national average, and a test positivity which is below the national average as well, 5.7 versus 7. In South Ayrshire and East Ayrshire, certainly I'm looking at South Ayrshire here, case numbers per 100,000 and test positivity is above the national average, and I think I'm struggling to find and even more so on cases on East Ayrshire as well. So that's basically the reason. We are seeing more signs of sustained decrease in North Ayrshire than in East Ayrshire and South Ayrshire. Now, obviously, the worry, and I know the geography of Ayrshire very well, of course, as Willie Coffey does, one of the worries is that people from East and South Ayrshire could go to North Ayrshire and take the virus from higher prevalence to lower prevalence. That illustrates why travel restrictions are so important, so that we don't have to put North Ayrshire in a higher level just to mitigate that risk. And I think Ayrshire, in many respects, Inverclyde within Greater Glasgow and Clyde also does so. It illustrates the difficulty of some of the judgments when you have a tiered level. But the alternative to that is to have all areas in the higher level that is driven by the areas with the highest levels of the virus, and that's not fair either. So we are trying to take as targeted and as proportionate approach as we possibly can.
Thank you. Alec Rowley to be followed by John Mason.
Presiding Officer, Unison Scotland published a survey this morning of their members who are charged with keeping our schools clean. Unison say that only 18% of cleaners said they had enough time and the right materials to clean schools properly and keep themselves safe in schools. Surprisingly, Freedom of Information shows that many authorities have not increased the number of cleaners they employ, despite the hygiene issues that come with COVID. I understand the government's priority of keeping our schools open, but does the First Minister understand the concerns of Unison and my concerns that our children must be kept safe when in school?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I haven't had the opportunity yet to see the survey. I will have a look at that, and if there are issues we need to address with local authorities out of that, we will absolutely do so. The Health and Safety Executive had previously, I think, commented that the preparations in terms of school return were good. We also made available £50 million to local authorities specifically to help them with things like enhanced cleaning and the other arrangements that were required to have schools return. But we are not complacent about any of this. As I think I said earlier on, the Deputy First Minister will publish another evidence paper about safety in schools tomorrow. I know Parliament will debate this tomorrow afternoon. We want to keep schools open because we think that is best for children, but we are not and never will be complacent about the safety of young people, teachers or others who work in schools. These are issues we take extremely seriously.
John Mason to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you. I know that visiting care homes is an extremely difficult subject, and that affects my own mother, who is in a neighbouring authority. Can the First Minister say anything about this as we move into level 4 especially?
The Health Secretary, I understand, has written to care home providers today to update how adult care home visiting is affected by the protection levels, and she will be giving a statement to Parliament on this shortly. Current care home visiting guidelines continue to be recommended for areas in levels 1 to 3 unless advised otherwise by local directors of public health, and for level 4, unfortunately, only essential window and garden visits are recommended. The advice also makes clear that visiting people in care homes is exempt from national travel restrictions, and people can travel into and out of level 3 and 4 areas to see loved ones in care homes because that is deemed to be essential travel.
Liz Smith to be followed by Joan McAlpine.
Thank you. Does the First Minister accept that in order to defeat the virus it's absolutely essential that there is full public trust in the Scottish Government's guidelines, and that to achieve that these guidelines must be clear and they must be consistent? Because I've got constituents who've been complaining to me that that's not always been the case. For example, when it came to the announcement on the 30th of October that all pupils in S4 and S6 in levels 3 and 4 would have to wear face coverings in class, but that instruction did not appear in the general guidelines for levels 3 and 4. So does she recognise that that can cause confusion, and will she ensure that local government and the Scottish Government work together to avoid any of that inconsistency?
First Minister.
I'm genuinely not aware of the particular problem there with issues of guidance over face coverings, but I'm happy to look into that. Certainly the guidance and face coverings in schools have been widely promoted by local authorities, and I believe is widely understood, and while not everybody will agree with any advice around this, I think the reasons for it are understood. More generally, I not only accept, I take very seriously the responsibility to try to set out as clearly as I can why we're doing certain things, not just what we're doing, but why we're doing them. Dealing with what we're dealing with right now, that is not always easy, because some of it is judgment, some of it are things that we're doing because we think but cannot be sure will make a difference. But I've tried to be open with people about the uncertainties and unpredictabilities of this, and that obviously means that we have to make sure the guidance is reflective of that. So I'm genuinely not sure of the particular issue Liz Smith is raising, but if there's an issue once I've had the chance to look into it, I'm happy to write to her.
Joan McAlpine to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you. Last week, a report from Public Health England found that people with learning disabilities were at least 6 times more likely to die of COVID-19. It's the latest in a number of reports that shows this group's vulnerability and shows why the suppression of the virus is so important. Given that the group weren't specifically mentioned in the original strategic framework, can the First Minister tell us what work is being done to keep them safe, and in particular when their carers will be offered regular testing?
First Minister.
There's a lot of work being done, and that has been the case throughout, to ensure that people with learning disabilities, who of course are at enhanced risk, as Jo McAlpine rightly points out, are kept as safe as possible. They are included in the plans that the Health Secretary will go into more detail about next week about testing, and I will ask the Health Secretary to write to Jo McAlpine more generally, just to set out the work that is being done on an ongoing basis to make sure that we are taking all the right precautions.
Thank you. Neil Bibby to be followed by Mike Brumbles.
The current round of restrictions in the West started in September, and 39 days ago the 16-day reset began. My constituents were told at the time that it would be short-term if they complied with the rules, but since restrictions have only got tighter, now most of the West is entering Tier 4. Is the First Minister's only explanation that this is all down to my constituents' failure to comply with the rules, or is there another reason why, for example, the failure of the Government to deliver mass testing and effective tracing in the areas that need it most?
First Minister.
Not only is that not my only explanation, it is not even one of my explanations. I have never tried to blame anybody in the course of this pandemic at all. What I have done is say clearly this is a global pandemic that is nobody's fault, but unfortunately it is down to all of us to tackle it. The biggest responsibility lies on the shoulders of government. That is right and proper, but with an infectious virus we all have to play our part. That's not blaming people, that's being honest with people about the challenges we face and how we overcome these challenges, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't set out to people the importance of complying with restrictions. And what I would say to Neil Bibby and others, clearly we face in Scotland, like so many other countries do, a very challenging situation, and that is we're seeing that at a sharp point today with a number of areas going into the top level of restrictions. But we are also in a position where, even with the prevalence levels that we are worried about right now and want to get lower, these are prevalence levels that are already lower than in the other nations of the UK and many other countries across Europe. The actions we have taken over these past few weeks have avoided a situation that we would otherwise have faced, where I would have been standing here announcing 3,000 cases every day. And if I had been doing that, I would also be announcing probably 3 times the number of people in hospital, if not more, maybe 3 times the number of deaths. So we have, through these sacrifices, managed to stop that happening. But I also have to be frank and honest with people that if we are to get through this next phase, hopefully this final phase, as safely as possible, we have to go further, not just to stabilise these infection levels, but to get them down further. That's not blaming anybody. That's recognising the nature of the challenge we face and what we have to do collectively to get through it.
Mike Rumbles to be followed by Alistair Allen.
I am not, and no one is accusing the First Minister for making these decisions lightly. Can I just first make that clear? They're difficult decisions, you all understand that. But for the very first time, the First Minister intends by regulations to make it illegal to travel from one area to another. This is without the authority of Parliament and may very well be illegal, since this is unenforceable and may not be a proportionate measure in law. Does she not understand that these draconian changes in law, and I would think everybody would agree they are draconian in the true sense of the word, that these draconian changes in the law should be a decision not made by her alone, and I actually think this could be helpful, not made by her alone, but by Parliament, and made by Parliament before such measures could come into effect. Will she undertake to ask Parliament to debate and vote on this before Friday, when she signs the regulations into law?
First Minister.
Can I say to Mike Rumbles, I accept what he said there. But all through me setting out what I respect his vehement disagreement with this. I really do. These are not easy and obviously not uncontroversial decisions. But my reaction was because he shouted continuously through me making the announcement, which I don't think recognises the difficulty and the severity of the situation we face. But let's put that to one side. There is, I understand, the Business Bureau probably hasn't been voted on by Parliament yet, has set aside time on Thursday for a debate and a vote on a motion. The travel restrictions will be in regulation. We have already said that we are keen to see Parliament approve regulations in advance of them coming into force. I understand Parliament is still considering the procedure for that. I'm not entirely sure where that has got to, but I'm equally not sure that is down to government preventing that happening. So perhaps that will be possible before these regulations come into place. I am not in any way objecting to that. But what I would say on the substance of this is the first time we've put travel restrictions in law in Scotland, I think, although back in the early days of the pandemic, there was legal restrictions on people leaving their house without reasonable excuse. But we've seen, right now, under the national lockdown in England, it is against the law to leave your house without reasonable excuse. In Wales, it has been the case that it is restricted in law moving between different parts of the country. It is now restricted in law moving in and out of Wales. In the Republic of Ireland, it is restricted in law. The point I'm making is that countries across the UK and across the wider, I think in France right now, you're not allowed to leave your house unless you've got papers that demonstrate that you're entitled to do so. Countries are having to take the most unbelievable, if we take ourselves back a year, decisions to keep people safe. And that's what we're trying to do. Keep people safe and have a situation where we don't have to have parts of the country living under restrictions when they don't have to. If we don't have travel restrictions, then the only way to stop the virus going from Glasgow to the Highlands is to have a national lockdown. I am really trying to avoid that because I don't think that is right if we can avoid it. But there is a trade-off for that, and I'm trying to be frank and honest with people about what that trade-off is.
Alistair Allen to be followed by Dean Lockhart.
Last week, a number of crew on MV Isle of Lewis tested positive for COVID-19, requiring a full crew changeover and meaning that the vessel herself had to be deep cleaned. Can I ask the First Minister what steps will be taken to prevent the recurrence of a similar situation, given the threat which any wider loss of lifeline ferry services would represent?
First Minister.
It's been CalMac's priority throughout to ensure the safety of passengers and crew by implementing the guidelines on travel and transport, and it is unfortunate that this outbreak occurred. CalMac and other ferry operators keep their cleaning, hygiene and physical distance processes under review. For CalMac, this includes a strict new onboard regime to keep staff and customers safe. It includes detailed cleaning every 90 minutes, implementation of physical distancing, signage, customer announcements and the use of PPE. All passengers need to wear face coverings in inside areas, and onboard food offering is restricted. The Transport Secretary, along with Transport Scotland officials, also engages weekly with ferry operators to ensure that they are fully updated on any changes to guidance and regulations, and this will continue.
Thank you. Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The application of Tier 4 restrictions to the Stirling Council area is deeply regrettable and will be a severe blow for local residents, workers and local firms who have been doing everything requested of them. Can the First Minister explain what precise data is available from Test and Protect and other sources in relation to the spread of coronavirus in the Stirling Council area? And based on this data, what's the First Minister's understanding of the main contributing factors for the spread of the virus in the Stirling Council area?
First Minister.
Well, in Stirling, and it is regrettable, Stirling is one of the areas where we have seen a sharp increase in recent times. In the last 7 days, the increase in case numbers per 100,000 in Stirling has been over 20%. What we do know is that there are some specific outbreaks that are contributing to this, including in food plants, and work has been done to control them and try to minimise the spread from them. But the view of the National Incident Management Team, and I understand the Director of Public Health locally, is that there is also wider spread community transmission, which will be coming from the same interactions, whether that is family gatherings, people within, albeit restricted, hospitality, other areas that come through Test and Protect, are people shopping, personal contact services. Now, let me say that doesn't mean that is absolutely certain that that's where people got the virus, but these are the settings that we now see come through the Test and Protect data much more strongly.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to finish proceedings there. Apologies to the half-dozen members who weren't able to call. Members may be interested to know that the Bureau will be discussing later whether or not to put some time aside on Thursday to debate, given the significance of these matters. We're going to move on now to... point of order, Mr Rumbles.
Thank you for that comment. Can we make it... When the Bureau looks at this very issue about a debate, if it is on Thursday and a vote on Thursday, could you use your best endeavours as a chair, as a defender of Parliament, to make sure that backbenchers, parliamentarians, have a chance, whether it's right or it's wrong, to debate and vote on these very important issues? The First Minister has made it quite clear she does not object to this. It's not an issue for government. It's an issue for you and the members of the Business Bureau.
Thank you. Mr Rumbles will be pleased to know that point was raised by business managers when we discussed, without preempting, this afternoon's decision. Thank you very much. We're going to move on shortly to the next item of business.